welcome back to yet another episode of your Re-Educated podcast. Today, we have a returning, very special guest, Dr. George Yancy. How are you doing today?
I'm doing well, and it's an honor to be back.
Yeah, no, I had such a lovely time last conversation. I was just like, I really, really wanted to talk to you, and I'm so glad we were able to find a time that worked, and now we're back here.
Excellent.
So last time we started, we did a huge dive into what race was, and we were talking about academia can often be very unpersonal. And so one question I wanted to first start with this time is to just get maybe a little bit more into who you are and in your background and how you got to where you are today. And one thing I wanted to ask you is, as a philosopher, is this word philosophy itself is so nebulous. Nobody really knows what it means. Sometimes I tell people I want to be a philosopher, and I'm like, do I really even want to say that? I don't even know what that means. So to you, what is philosophy, first of all? And then what does it mean to be a philosopher?
Sure. Good question. In fact, that's not unusual. When I finally fell in love with philosophy, or it fell in love with me, one or the other way, both work,
Mm.
I think. People would say, "Oh, so you're going to study things about human behavior?" And I'd say, "No, that's psychology," right? But they just couldn't understand. Philosophy is this abstract thing that had no relevance, right, to the everyday world. Um, so for me, what was interesting is that I wanted to be a pilot. So my mom had bought me and my sister these encyclopedias, and one day I was reading through the P encyclopedia under pilot. I look at pilots, planes, and so on, and I came across this word, philosophy, and it said it comes from two Greek words, philosophia, which together mean the love of wisdom. And I thought immediately, the love of wisdom? Like, what is this? This is incredible. And the reason that it was incredible for me is because after reading the entire entry, I realized that the questions that philosophers were asking and addressing: does God exist? What is the meaning of life? What is the good life? What is ethics? What is virtue? What is courage? What happens after we die? How do we demonstrate the existence of God? Et cetera. What is identity? Et cetera, et cetera. I had always been asking these questions as a young boy. So when I
Mm.
found out that there was a field, I said, "Oh no!" And immediately I recall going to my guidance counselor in high school and asking her if this was a field and whether or not one could actually study it. And she said yes. And of course, I mean, the from there, it's all history, right? But what's interesting, I think, in terms of what philosophy meant to me, and I'll just give you one example. I was raised as a Baptist, as Christian, and I remember one day uh, asking my mom, because she would have me and my sister kneel down, and we'd say something called, this it's this prayer where you say, "Now I lay me down to sleep. I pray the Lord my soul to keep." It's sort of the children's prayer, or the child's prayer. And what you do is you'd go through that and you'd say, "God bless my mother, my sister," and you'd name your friends. Well, one day I decided to ask my mom if it was okay to pray for the devil. Now, I was very young, maybe
Mm.
10 or 11. And of course, you can imagine my mom thinking, "Oh my God, what's going on here?" Right? But I was being taught that the devil is a malevolent entity. And I thought, hey, this young black kid could maybe lend the devil a hand in terms of helping him to, reshape his life, reshape his existence. So there I was on my knees, and I'd say, "God bless my mother, my sister, and my friends." And then I'd say at the very end, "And God bless the devil," right? And then I remember another time where I said to my mom, I knew that things died, but I didn't understand that someday I would die or that she would die. And I remember saying to my mom, and again, I can only imagine that she was really frustrated and taken aback by this. I said to her, in a very angry way, "Why did you give birth to me? Only to
Mm.
die, only to die," right? Um, So what am I saying by this? I'm saying that as at an early age, so 10, 11, 12, I'm already asking questions um, that are philosophical in nature, but I don't know that it's called something like philosophical
Mm,
questions, right? And so that for me, um, philosophy as the love of wisdom, as philosophia, coming from those two Greek terms, it's just a way of thinking about how it is that all cultures, I think, throughout history, have asked very important questions regarding what it means to be human, what it means to be a person, what it means to have a relationship with the cosmos, what it means to have certain beliefs, what it means to create a community, what it means to love, etc., etc. So I think that this to do philosophy, in other words, you don't have to take philosophy 101. I think that in virtue of being human, in virtue of being the kinds of beings who are not determined, but who have a level of freedom, I think that we are philosophical in nature, in nature, right? We are designed, let's not say design, we're the kinds of beings who, because we're capable of wonder, because we're capable of engaging in a meta level of analysis, because we can engage in self reflection, we ask these deep philosophical questions about ourselves and
mm,
about the world. So, my entry into philosophy was really, again, by accident of looking through the encyclopedia under P for pilot or plane, and then there it is falling for philosophy. But again, realizing that I'd always been doing philosophy. I just didn't know it as formally as philosophy.
mm,
And, for me, there's a way of thinking about philosophy as Aristotle or Plato, the Western tradition, would say that it is a site of wonder, a site of wonder. And for me, I would argue, yes, philosophy is about wonder. It is about being struck by stuff or having experiences that are uncanny, that are awe-inspiring. So in that way, philosophy attempts to defamiliarize us with the world, to make those things that are familiar appear unfamiliar so that we can interrogate them at a different level. But for me, I've come to understand philosophy as a mode of suffering. And I say that for at least three reasons. Uh, Philosophy is a mode of suffering because, quite frankly, I don't know why I'm here. I don't mean why I'm here in this room or why we're engaging in this conversation. I mean, I don't know why we're here, as in, why do we exist rather than not existing? So, this is a question that the German philosopher Martin Heidegger would raise. Why is there something rather than nothing? And that question is weighty. It has a certain kind of existential gravitas that for me um, weighs heavy upon me because that also involves the question from where do we come, or does God exist, or what is our origin? So those huge questions for me, because there is no definitive answer, weigh heavily upon me, and therefore I
mm,
suffer. Another way of thinking about philosophy of suffering is the sheer um, weight of human suffering in the world, whether it's from racism, sexism, colonialism, gratuitous violence, the death of infants, the problem of immigration, totalitarianism, you name it, right? It's because we suffer as human beings. And there are times when I don't feel as if I can sort of magically erase that or make those things come to an end immediately, right? We sort of have to wait. And it's that waiting for human suffering to end that is also a mode of suffering and also a mode of studying philosophy. And lastly, I think that for me, given the kind of philosophy that I do, given that my philosophy is very public facing, so that I will write an article in the New York Times called Dear White America, right? Or I will write an article called I'm a Dangerous Professor, right? These articles, what they do is they generate levels of backlash because I would dare speak with parrhesia. I think we talked about that word before, Parrhesia, which means courageous speech or to say it all. There's a way in which I see myself as a contemporary Socratic gadfly. Like Socrates used to go out in the emporium or the marketplace and ask the Athenians, why don't you care more for virtue, or why don't you care more for justice, or why don't you care more for your soul? And this would make them uncomfortable, profoundly uncomfortable, because he was like a gadfly, and a gadfly is a fly that would sting horses, right? And so I
Mm,
see myself in doing the kind of philosophy that I do, like what is the meaning of racism? What is the meaning of whiteness? Why is there racism? Why is it that whiteness is so hegemonic and oppressive? How do we undo systems of misogyny? Because I'm posing these questions. I'm posing these questions in a way that threaten the very structures that uphold those forms of hegemony, those forms of violence. And to do so means that I then get the backlash. So in the case of Dear
mm,
White America, all the white racist responses that I received, from messages and emails to threats by way of my dean, to people sending me postcards, right? So for
wow.
me, philosophy is this incredible, weighty practice that requires of us um, to address and to ask those questions that are often most painful to us individually and collectively.
Mm.
Yeah.
That was a beautiful introduction to what philosophy is. I
Mm,
think when I think about what philosophy is, it's I don't know if I can necessarily put a word on it, but it has changed my life. I think the kind of empty, aimless living that I was doing prior to being in environments where these questions were even asked was just, I was so directionlessness. I was so directionless. And then I came across these questions of, I took a class on Hellenistic thinking, and I took a class on ethics, and then all of a sudden I was like, everything that I'm doing is underlying certain principles. It's just that I actually didn't find those principles for myself. They've just been deeply imbued by family, by culture, and it was not me actively doing any thinking that was making me lead my life the way that I did. And all of a sudden, through philosophy, I started finding math interesting. I found the sciences interesting. All of a sudden, the entire world became interesting. And so I don't know if I can necessarily tell that value to somebody else, because this is the next question I have for you, because I hear this all the time, particularly from the immigrants that I'm around when I come back home to the Bay Area. They say things like, this is all very abstract thinking, and anyone who needs to, like, put food on their table doesn't have time to ask these questions, right? Like, how am I supposed, why would I care about all these things? I need to make sure I get my job done and I can eat. And I don't really ever know what to say to this, because I'm like, am I wasting my time in abstract, kind of just, the abstract world of academia, or are these really important questions? And so I'm
mm.
curious, what has your journey been if people do say those things to you? And I'm curious if people do. And what has your journey been like answering that for yourself?
Sure. Excellent, excellent point. I would agree with you, by the way, that for me, when I began to read philosophical texts as early as 17, 18 years old, which, by the way, was highly unusual for me to be reading, let's say, Bertrand Russell's The History of Western Philosophy, or trying to understand Plato on my own, or Spinoza. It was very, very difficult. But what I did find is that that philosophical engagement metastasized and actually improved other areas of my learning. So it was like, all of a sudden, cosmology or
Yeah.
astronomy or all of these areas. That's
Everything
right.
becomes fascinating.
That's right. Absolutely. So I agree with you. And I think it has to do with philosophy's um, sort of internal logic, which is to grapple, to ask, to inquire, but not just like the scientist does, but to ask these deeper meta questions. Like the scientist might be concerned with, doing certain kinds of experiments, relying on certain kinds of evidence, but the philosopher steps back and says, yeah, but what is the meaning of evidence? How does experimentation get us to a result? And can everything fall under empirical experimentation, right? Are there not certain subjects that don't, sort of, whose truth or falsity cannot be demonstrated through experimentation? So I agree with you. But I also had the other experience, which was, I recall when I was at the University of Pittsburgh, I was on a bus, the public transportation. And it was a white guy who was talking to me about what I was studying, and I told him I was studying philosophy. And he was speaking very loudly, and he was saying, oh, philosophy, my God, what are you going to do with that? You need to go into computers, right? This is where the money is, right? If you want to do something in life, you need to go into computers, or business or some other area, but my God, not philosophy. So there was that deep implication, or I shouldn't say implication, it's very explicit there, that philosophy is a waste of time. It is nugatory, it is inconsequential to anything quote unquote important in life. So what happened was I stood up, and by this time I was feeling a little embarrassed, and sort of didn't have a lot of energy because he was, again, other people were hearing him. And I walked to the front of the bus, and as the bus driver opened the door, I held onto the rail. I made one step, put one foot down, and there was this is a small elderly woman, white woman, who touched my hand. She touched my hand, and I turned to the right and I looked at her face, and she looked at me and she said, "Money is not everything." And I just got off the bus. And so there was this beautiful moment, right, where unpredictably this woman just touches my hand and says, "Money isn't everything." And so at that point, I got off and said, "Yes, that's exactly right." Right. Um, so here's the thing. In my career, I remember telling my mom that I wanted to study philosophy, and my uncle was her brother, was a minister, and he said, "Well, he's going to become an atheist, right?" Or someone else said again, "If you're studying philosophy, you have to be wealthy. Like somehow you have to come from wealth if you're going to do this, right?" So all these signs that suggested to me that this is a dead end, right? You should not be doing this. But here's the thing. I always tell my students, you don't technically have to take a course in physics to know how to walk on the ground. You know what I mean? Or that you'll be able to walk, right? You just walk. You don't technically have to take a course in physics. But this is what I tell them. Philosophy is indispensable, meaning you don't even have to take this course, but in virtue of being alive, in virtue of being conscious, in virtue of being a part of a community, you are already doing philosophy. I asked them, "Have you ever fallen in love?" Yes. Have you ever had to deal with the pain of someone dying? Yes. Have you ever been in a situation where you're sort of debating what's true and false? Yes. So I say to them, it is precisely during those moments that you're doing philosophy. So
Hmm.
I say to them, you can't help but to do philosophy. And you can do it not so great, less critically, but to the extent that you're human, you're faced with issues of love or the lack thereof. You're faced with the question of whether I ought to do X or ought not to do X. In other words, questions of ethics or morality. um, is something beautiful. A painting, a picture, a human being, a piece of food, or whatever it happens to be, right? A plate of food. These are aesthetic judgments, ethical judgments. You might find yourself in a conversation where you're debating a friend as to whether God exists or not, or some scripture in a holy text. You're doing hermeneutics. So my point is that when folk come to me and they say things like, "Well, philosophy doesn't bake any bread. What are you going to do?" Well, here's the thing: you're already doing philosophy as well. You just don't know it, right? You just haven't
Hmm.
committed yourself in the way in which I've committed myself. And let's just think seriously about it. Are there careers for philosophers? Of course there are. Not always in philosophy, depending on the market, but law schools very much appreciate their incoming students who have had philosophical training. Medical schools, the same, particularly in terms of medical ethics and so on. So my sense is that individuals who say that have a completely uh, they have a misconstrual or completely misunderstanding of what the nature of philosophy is, because to be alive, to be human, is to do philosophy, is to make decisions that are predicated on reasons. They do
Hmm.
things for which there are explanations, all of which, um, though implicit for them or unknowingly for them are based upon a set of principles that they have already bought into. So what we're trying to do in philosophy is to make you more aware, to make one more aware of those presuppositions and to interrogate them and to question them and to also take not take for granted anything,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
To open the whole field of human experience to interrogation and questioning, right?
Yeah.
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
it's just, because when you're saying, medical student, I can't think of a single profession where some form of philosophical training wouldn't be advantageous, except perhaps maybe, my dad was telling me this. He was like, if you're a soldier, you don't want to question. He was like, I was like, that might be the only place where questioning might be dangerous. Everyone just puts their guns down, and go, why are we fighting?
But you see, I think it was that was your dad.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think your dad's right. But you see, that's a wonderful way of thinking about how philosophy is such a danger to the
Yes.
status quo, right? And this is
Very.
why Socrates was put to death. This is why he had to drink the hemlock because he was a gadfly. Because, like Martin Luther King, I'm going any other direction, but because King actually refers to Socrates, he himself sees himself, King, in the spirit of Socratic questioning, something called alenkos, which is self-examination and cross-examination. Um, if you're in the military, of course, if you begin to ask the question, do I have a right because I'm authorized by the US to take a life? I mean, that's deeply disturbing, meaning that's going to disturb the status quo. If you're in a democracy and you ask the question, is this a democracy? Right? What's the problem with practices that, as far as we can see, are undermining the very foundations of democracy?
Mm,
If you're in a relationship and you ask your partner, what what does it mean that we're in love? You know,
yes.
or I know I've heard you say it, but do you know what it means? Even at that very, basic one-on-one level can be very tricky, right?
Yes.
And very threatening. But it shouldn't be, because philosophy should have as its end a greater understanding of how the world holds up. I mean, there was a philosopher who I studied with named Wilfred Sellers, and he defines philosophy as, and I'm gonna don't have it verbatim, but roughly he says philosophy aims to understand how things, in the broadest sense of that term, hang together in the broadest sense of that term. And so when he says things, he says he includes cabbages, kings, and finger snaps, right? Of course, I include whether there's a soul, what's the meaning of race, what's the meaning of gender, what's the meaning of violence and exploitation and power. All of those are things, and the objective is to see how things hold together. It's a synoptic view. How do we circumspectively understand the world? And that's very ethical too, right? When we're trying to figure
Mm,
out the ethical thing to do, it ought to involve a very circumspective process. And circumspective just means that, to look around, right? To analyze the various options before one and the implications of what an action will entail,
mm,
this sort of thing. Yeah.
yeah. So, you brought up something there talking about how philosophy can be dangerous. And this is something I've been hearing. I've been watching the State of the Union, the rebuttal. I've just been recently keeping up a lot more with politics. And one sentiment that I'm hearing a lot is that there is this high, like, large organization that's hidden, some Illuminati that's kind of controlling what everyone else thinks, sees, and feels, right? And so that they're the ones who are really setting what the status quo is. And it's really hard, I think, as somebody, growing up in middle class, and I haven't even really, until I got to Georgetown, I've never even really seen somebody who was like uber wealthy. And then, I started, I saw these little kids owning yachts, and I felt like I was able to look at one class higher and being like, okay, this is how people in this class function. And so I'm curious, in your journey of publishing and speaking out and having people respond very negatively to you, do you feel that there is some truth to this, that there is some sort of like, higher group of hidden people who are kind of setting the status quo, or is the status quo just set naturally?
That's an excellent question. I would say to the first part, I would say no, meaning this. I don't think, I mean, in the language, right, in popular sort of discourse, and if you look at YouTube videos enough, you'll get this, right? And before long, if you're not careful, you get swallowed up
Yeah.
into this vacuum and echo chamber where before long you'll believe that the earth is flat, right? And so first of all, I'd say no, I don't believe that there's a a group of individuals, let's call them the Illuminati, who or even this is probably not very different from the idea of a deep state, right? That there's some kind of super organization that runs the world of which we are just mere puppets. No, I don't believe that. But we can reject that while at the same time holding on to the view that there are wealthy families in the world, particularly in the United States, who have inordinate amounts of power and inordinate amounts of wealth and inordinate amounts of influence on politics. There's no question about that, right? So there are the super rich, and money, given that money drives this society, money and power, hegemony, then we can clearly understand how it's in the interests of those individuals who have power who control stuff. Wall Street, right? So yes, that's not mythical. It seems to me that that's not a a mythological way of thinking about the world. I think there's a way in which to blame things on Illuminati or the deep state is just a side of obfuscation. It's a way in which we flee our own freedom. There's a way in which we can just say things like, well, they control the Illuminati control the world, and no matter what we do, we can't change it, right? It really sort of takes away, in a way, kind of human agency. I think to really understand that we can make a difference in the world, and two, that the world isn't like this mystical or mythological construct that is necessary for us to make sense of the world. We just don't need to um, put our eggs in that basket, right? Where we gain a sense of coherence by understanding that. Because again, it functions to rationalize our sense of who we are. If we're living in poverty, there's a way in which we could say, well, there's the Illuminati, right? As opposed to there's something called capitalism, right? Where people are not being valued as workers, or where they're the lumpen proletariat, where people don't have access to jobs that can be explained through the history of capitalism, and the way in which capital is distributed unjustly, and where there's not equity. So no, I don't think that, but I do think the other. But at the same time, I think that um, what philosophy does then, it attempts to encourage us to think clearly about these matters. It helps us to think, to engage in self-interrogation so that we're able to understand the ways in which we are vehicles for the perpetuation and the recreation of
Hmm.
forms of ideology that blind us to the truth of the world, right? Because as long as there's those echo chambers telling us about Illuminati, about a deep state, they're politicians who will use this precisely to divide us. Before long, we're thinking that the Democrats are, in fact, you know, having these bizarre sexual parties where people are being killed and children and so on. But by the time we've absorbed that, then we've laid the foundation for believing that there is a hero, a white male hero, who will free us, who will lead us to this land where there is no deep state, where this kind of sexual immorality is not going on at all. But this is absolutely, it's a seductive kind of deception that creates an us versus them dichotomy. You and I may have talked about this before, where we're not seeing our common interests, where we're not thinking critically and collectively, where there could be agonism or tension, but tension is important for conversation. What we don't want is violence. Where we don't want is erasure or the absolute silencing of voices, right? Of course,
Mm,
violence can do that. So I think that philosophy speaks to the very question you're raising. Philosophy attempts to make us all gadflies, not only to the social, but gadflies to ourselves, to engage in a kind of meutic, this is a term that Socrates uses as well, a kind of meutic process. And this is relevant to education as well. So now I'm connecting. I think I'm connecting. The meutic method is the idea that one's interlocutor will help them to understand the ideas that a person has that might be implicit but not explicit. So in a classroom, the objective of the teacher, one objective, is to get students to rely upon their own brilliance, right? So the idea is not a top-down educational system, hence the critique of the banking system. I think I may have mentioned this before through Paulo Freire, but the idea is dialogical. So the teacher then, or let's say the one who is part of the dialogue or the multilogue, attempts to get students to realize that they're already brilliant. It's just that these things are
mm,
implicit, and let me help to facilitate and get them out. And it seems to me that this meutic method, writ large, within the context of the social political, the objective then is to get people to understand that they have insights. It's just that it's been covered over by the threats of ideology, the threats of obfuscation, ways of keeping them tied into the status quo. And not that someone has taught them in a kind of top-down, systematic way, such that they sat them down to teach them, right? It doesn't happen that way. Rather, it's pervasive throughout the society. It depends on where you go to get your news. You will hear it.
mm,
In other words, so the false information, the lies, the mythologies are circulating within the society. And many of us are there like sponges absorbing this because, for the most part, the system has created the very individuals who have, as it were, given up on themselves as agents and therefore need
mm,
to believe in lies in order for them to get through the day, right? But what
mm,
we want are courageous individuals who are able to confront their lives. And granted, people are starving. Even in the United States, people are impoverished. What do we do? Well, philosophy isn't antithetical to poverty, right? Philosophy isn't the wealthy white man's project. I mean, Black people during enslavement, plantation enslavement, were asking questions, philosophical questions. What is the meaning of freedom? Right? Why is it that I'm being told by the master that God intended for me to be a slave? What's called you know, the myth of Ham. Who says that? So Black folk are under those conditions of gratuitous violence and enslavement and being relegated to the status of the slave. They're asking philosophical questions. So I don't want to think that philosophy is something that there are people who are too preoccupied with practical stuff can't engage in. I think that's part of the misunderstanding of what philosophy does,
mm. And the
right?
power of it, which
And the
seems,
power of it.
yeah. I'm thinking about Viktor Frankl. I mean, I think his ability to use philosophy and deep thinking to get through his experiences, during the Holocaust is, I think, an extreme testament to the power of philosophical thinking. So,
Absolutely.
one question I have for you is, so on your bio, it says that, Yancy is particularly interested in the formation of African American philosophical thought. And I thought that was really interesting. And I wanted to ask you a little bit about that particular distinction. So for you, what is the difference between philosophical thought or yeah, why is the African American philosophical thought an important part? What distinguishes that form of thought?
Excellent. Good question. Well, here's the part of the problem is that, um, like Black History Month names itself. It has to name itself because it's a question of agency and empowerment. Um, of course, Black History Month started off as Black History Week and was founded by Black historian Carter G. Woodson. The problem here is that every other month is not Black History Month, um, and therefore it's not named. In other words, it's White History Month, the other 11 months. But whiteness is normative. It doesn't have to name itself. It is as I refer to it as the transcendental norm. It's deemed unraced, unnamed, invisible. So when we talk about African American philosophy or Black philosophy or Africana philosophy, those terms are doing something to modify this thing called philosophy. And I'll give you an excellent example. The late brilliant philosopher Charles Mills wrote an article called Non-Cartesian Sums, S-U-M-S, and Cartesian refers to Descartes. It's his Latinized, Rene Descartes. It's his Latinized name, Renatus Cartesius. And what Mills does so brilliantly is he says, look, if I'm going to teach a course in African American philosophy, which is one of my areas, or Africana philosophy, how do I teach it in such a way that Black students or students of color can relate to this? And he uses Descartes as a prime example of how doing philosophy creates a problem, in this case for Black people. If you've read the meditations, or if those in your who are part of your audience have read the meditations, they'll know that Descartes is famously known for the expression cogito ergo sum, which means I think, therefore I am. And Descartes starts his meditations by doubting. It's called hyperbolic doubt. He doubts everything. He doubts that the world exists. He doubts that he exists. He doubts that he has a body. And this is kind of what he does methodologically in order to come to something that he can't doubt. And eventually, of course, he comes to the conclusion that um, my existence cannot be doubted because even as I'm doubting, I must exist in order to doubt. But here's the point. Um, it's this freedom, this sense of privilege, we should say, that Descartes has to doubt everything around him that Mills wants to suggest is typical of what he calls the conceptual whiteness of the field. In other words, white philosophers will engage in questions that are so abstract that they are removed from the everyday world, right? And he
Hmm.
calls this ideal theory. And ideal theory is precisely a mode of theory that abstracts away from the concreteness of lived experience. It abstracts away from, so it takes away from. And he calls that mode of engaging in philosophy where it doesn't abstract, he calls it non-ideal theory. So let me give you an example. Let's assume that I'm teaching a course on Descartes. And let's say that George Floyd, who had that deadly encounter with the white police officer and the other police officers, let's say that he survived that. And let's say that he was a student in my class. Well, let's say that that happened on a Monday and I have my class on a Tuesday. I open up the text, we're reading Descartes. I say to the class, Descartes wants us to doubt our existence. Descartes wants us to doubt the existence of the world. And George Floyd's in the back of the class. He raises his hand, and I say yes. He says, I'm not going to use any expletives, but he says, what the hell? I'll say, what the hell are you talking about? And I go, well, you know, I'm talking about what Descartes' doing. Let's assume that I'm a white professor. And George Floyd says, I can't do that. And the white professor says, well, what do you mean you can't do that? Of course you can. You can carry out Descartes' project. And then George Floyd begins to tell us that for over 9 minutes, he had a white police officer's knee on his neck and that he almost died, right? And on his back. And he talks about how he was accused of having a fake $20 bill. He talks about how the history of racism was in that space. The history was also bearing upon his back and upon his neck to the point where he almost became, well, he was asphyxiated, but didn't die. I would have to, and then he would say to me, what Descartes is doing is a perk of white privilege. I don't get the privilege to live my life through doubting the external world. If anything, I have to affirm the external world in order for me to save my own life. I have to fear that white police officers will pull me over even though I haven't done anything wrong. I have to fear that when I'm shopping that I will be followed or surveilled or undergo white surveillance. So there's a way in which I can't engage in that project, Descartes, or saying to the white professor, your project denies my existence as black. It denies the fact that I live in an anti-black world. So I think African American philosophy then, it's what Mills says, blackness is often seen as that which does not illuminate. Whiteness has these tropes of illumination, enlightenment, uh, clarity,
Hmm.
even ethical terms like virtue, right?
Hmm.
Goodness, uh, you know, um, uh, angelic, divine, right? Whereas blackness is sullied, it's nasty, it's dark, it's stupid, it's ignorance, right? And so blackness, however, Mills wants to say, and hence by extension African American philosophy, because black people have this situated reality, they bring a certain kind of knowledge or a certain kind of episteme that overturns or that upends this philosophical way of looking at the world, which is really a particular white male way of looking at the world, right? So
Hmm.
African American philosophy then takes very seriously the everyday, quotidian experiences of Black people who undergo forms of gratuitous violence and anti Black racism and poses similar questions as let's say, Western philosophy does, but significantly changes the meaning of those terms so that what is identity? Identity is not this abstract thing that we all have that is the same and doesn't change according to one's context and racial or gendered identity. It asks the question of what is the meaning of God? For example, what is the meaning of God in the world in which Black people constantly suffer? This is the question of theodicy.
Hmm.
What does it mean to be ethical in a world in which, for the most part, all of the terms that philosophers use, like ethics, virtue, um, etc., were in fact denied of Black people, right? So African American philosophy, part of its role is to articulate the Black experience, not as this marginalized experience irrelevant to philosophy, but to
Hmm.
show how African American philosophy is a corrective to a form of philosophy that has always been hegemonic and thereby erasing the experiences of those individuals who've been marginalized.
Got it. So, okay, so a
Yeah.
question for you, because one thing that I'm trying to understand is there's two things that was going through my head as you were speaking, which is the first part of what you were saying, which is the example of George Floyd, which is, what is really the point of having this particular conversation when this is what's happening to me in my life? It sounds similar to what we had talked about in the beginning of the conversation, which was there are some people who says, what's the point of studying philosophy? It's all abstract stuff. I need to eat and feed myself. So one thing that perhaps what you're suggesting is that perhaps sometimes, especially metaphysics, I think sometimes can be really, really abstract of like, if God exists, where does God exist? Where I feel like it takes a certain level of privilege to be able to like spend time thinking about that. But that doesn't speak to all of philosophy. All of philosophy is not that, right? Because one of the other questions you asked is how can God exist when people are suffering so deeply is a lot more personal and can impact people even in, across the socioeconomic spectrum. And so I guess that's my question. Is it possible, for example, metaphysics, can that be, is it just which subject is focused on? Or are you saying that in every subject there is a African American way of looking at it and not? Or is it just like metaphysics itself just cannot be looked at through that lens? Does that make
Ah,
sense?
absolutely. It's a beautiful question. Let me answer it this way. Let's first of all specifically name what we're talking about in terms of categories, because we're not talking about Asian American philosophy. We're not talking about Indian philosophy. We're not talking about indigenous philosophy. We're talking about Western philosophy, that mode of philosophy that we understand its progenitors to be from Socrates onward or from Thales onward to Heidegger, Kant, Hume, and those characters, and also Anglo-American philosophy, Bertrand Russell, Richard Rorty, up to our current moment, right? So here's the thing. So you have various fields in philosophy. Epistemology, which is the study of knowledge. How do we know what we know? We have ontology, the study of being. What does it mean for things to be as they are? We have questions regarding axiology, which is the study of value. What is value? Aesthetics, what is beauty? Ethics, what is the good thing to do? Um, Metaphysics, studying the ultimate nature of reality. Like, what is the ultimate nature of reality? In fact, what's interesting is that cosmology and ontology are two branches of metaphysics. And I think that your point's a good one because what a Mills would say is that there are ways of doing each of those fields in a way, if they're taken up by particular individuals in a certain kind of social group or racialized group who see who don't understand how their privilege is related to the kinds of questions that they ask within metaphysics,
Mm.
they obfuscate reality. So that in this case, then the Black philosopher or the African American philosopher will come along and say, metaphysics isn't um, irrelevant because it's abstract as such, or epistemology isn't irrelevant because it's abstract as such, or ontology and so on. What the African American philosopher, in this case, the African American philosopher who does African American philosophy, will say, let us interrogate metaphysics. Let us rethink it in terms of what we might call social metaphysics, right? Where it's a metaphysics that isn't just concerned with why is X, what does it mean for X not to exist in a world of that is not even grounded in reality. In other words, what does it mean to? Here's a good question. Here's a way of putting it. What does it mean to talk about numbers existing and not existing? Are numbers real? Now, I'm saying sure. That's a relevant question. I think that philosophers should consider the question of whether numbers are real or not, whether triangles exist out in some Platonic universe. But the question is not that I mean, the issue is not that that's a false question. Question is how in this case does that question relate to my own individual experiences when it comes to what it means to live in a world in which my death is always already imminent? One can think about whether there are numbers, but one can't take that as the end of what metaphysics is. And I think that
Hmm.
what happens is white, I'm going to just say it, white philosophers, white male philosophers have historically defined these fields, these branches, in a very hermetic way, such that the questions that are posed are considered the real questions and the only questions. Whereas you bring a set of experiences in, the Black experience, that then mediates the questions. One is saying, one is critiquing the field metaphilosophically, and one is saying, what, not just what are the questions that are being examined, but what is the meaning of philosophy itself? Right? So that's metaphilosophical. To ask about the meaning of philosophy itself outside of a traditionally handed down conception of what philosophy has been for white males, right? So the metaphysical question, the social metaphysical question of what does it mean to be Black in the world is a question that Fanon has grappled with, Du Bois has grappled with, um, Ida B. Wells has grappled with, right? These, you know, John Coltrane, Stevie Wonder, right? You name it. Snoop Dogg, you name your rapper, right? These are from philosophy to rap. These are all the questions that Black folk ask that are social metaphysical or that have social metaphysical importance. So, what I want to suggest then is that what we have to pin down is how
Hmm.
is it that these areas have been tethered to a particular social, racial group that have defined these questions as the quintessential questions that are asked in metaphysics versus opening up the canon to these other
Mm.
questions that mediate other experiences of other individuals.
I'm getting it now. Yeah, I mean,
How does that sound? Yeah.
yeah, that sounds really good. I think I'm really getting what you're saying because it's something I think a lot about, especially in the way that I teach as well, which is relevance, which is the second you extract relevance from whatever it is you're teaching, it's, I mean, I'm working with this student right now and we're going through, calculus and we're doing all this logarithm stuff. And, my mathematical nerdy brain is fascinated by like, why is this the case? But to him, the relevance of the stuff that he's learning and the speed in which he's expected to learn the stuff is just not feasible. It's not doable. And so it is just removed all relevance to anything that he cares about or is doing in his day to day. And so all of a sudden, it comes off as if he's bad at math or whatever. But that's not actually what it is. It's just that there is no connection of what it is that he is doing to his day to day life. And therefore, nobody should be expected to do well in a situation like that. And so, one of the hardest things I think that in my opinion a good teacher does is like find relevance however they can. They need to find the relevance to connect it to their student. So a question I have for you, which is really difficult, is that when you have a classroom of 30, 50, 100 all different people, what is some strategies to find common relevance, because it's not possible to do it when you have a larger class size.
Yeah, good question. Let me add, by the way, to what you said. This issue of extracting relevance. This is again what ideal theory does. It removes the relevance, and this is why the relevance to a certain racialized group, and this is why Mills says or poses the question, why aren't there many blacks in philosophy? Well, precisely because these subjects aren't relevant, meaning that I shouldn't say they're not relevant. The way in which they're being construed and handed down, historically
Hmm.
mediated, they're not relevant. You're not asking a question to. This is a question that George Floyd would find meaningless, right?
Hmm.
So George Floyd can understand what Descartes is saying. It's not that George Floyd would lack the capacity to understand what Descartes is saying in his meditations. It's just that George Floyd is saying there's a big fallacy here, that those questions are questions that we all ask, and it's just not the case,
Hmm.
right? So I think your point is a really good segue to what I was saying. In a class, what you want to do, I think, is what you want to do is have a class that is diverse. And by diverse, I don't just mean that there are different hues of bodies that are showing up because you can have a diversity of colors, as it were, in the classroom, and yet many of those students think the same way, right? So we can't assume because there's a diversity of hues that somehow there's going to be a diversity of views. That just doesn't. That's a nice rhyme as well, but it doesn't mean that it's going to follow, right? But here's the point. I think that for me, my aim is to try to make a distinction between those problems that will impact, sorry, is to raise questions that will impact all of us in virtue of being human, despite the fact that historically some of us weren't deemed human. So the question regarding the existence of God, I think, is a question that we all need to ask. Does God exist? If God does exist, what is the nature of God? How do we know which religion has access to God? Is it Hinduism, like in a sort of polytheistic? Is it Judaism? Is it Christianity? Is it Islam, Zoroastrianism, Sikhism? What is it, right? If God does exist, how does God's omnibenevolence square with the fact that there's evil in the world? Um, what is ultimate reality? What is it? Is it what the atomists say? Is it atoms? Or if string theory is true, or is it strings? If a pantheist is right, is that everything is made of God, or is everything made of life, as in animism? What is the meaning of death, since this is something that we all face? What happens afterward? So that's the level at which I think as human beings, we're all going to face that question. But then what I'd want to do is deal with questions that realize how we are individuals in our humanity, so that if there are Black students, students of color, white students, those who identify as women, those who are non-binary, those who are queer, et cetera, et cetera. And perhaps those students who don't have a lot of money, right? What I want so economic differences in the classroom. What I'd want to do is tailor those questions and ask my students to begin to think about how those questions now are mediated or filtered through their own lived experiences, right? And in that way, you're sort of saying, this is what we have in common, but let's not let the common override the particularity of our individual experiences. And I think a really good teacher, um, a really good pedagogue, someone who is engaged in as an interlocutor with one's students, it is important that they are able to tailor those questions to the experiences of the students, because otherwise the students, their experiences are placed under erasure. In other words, they are in the classroom feeling as if their epistemic integrity has been violated,
Hmm.
right? And so to bring out the individuality of each student and to validate their individual experiences, I think that pedagogically, we have to deal with non-ideal theory, even as we might deal
Hmm.
with abstraction at a different level, right? Because that's what students want. They, I think that what we have to do then as teachers is we have to validate their brilliance. We have to validate their experiences so that they're not being made to feel that they're not relevant in that pedagogical space.
Yeah.
Otherwise, pedagogy is just a form of violence. It's a form of
Hmm.
rejection of who individual students are, when that's certainly that's
Hmm.
antithetical to what education ought to be.
100%. I mean, yes, I feel what you're saying so, what's the word? It's very embodied because I find so much pain when students come to me and say, I can't do this or I'm not capable of doing this. But it's very clear that the only thing is that you just at this point in your life don't care to do this, and that is completely fine. And something, and I just kind of want to, this isn't really a question. I just wanted to throw this out there because it's something I think about a lot. But I've found that there's three types of students and in all the teaching that I've done. And I'm just curious what you think about this. So I have found students who just don't care about school and don't care about really learning. And they're like, I don't really care. And we usually typically group these kids as like, oh my god, that they're just, it's going to be so hard to help them by the time they get to high school. Let's just not put teachers will be like, let's not put too much focus here. Then you have a large group of these kids, and these kids are the ones that typically people are like, oh my god, they're doing so well in school. But the thing is, they don't actually have a love for learning. They have a love for success. They have a love for the validation that comes from doing well. They don't actually care at all about the thing that they're learning. And I have met so many students in this bucket, and people still treat them like, wow, you're doing so well in school. It's awesome. But they don't actually care. And then there's a tiny, tiny, tiny percent of students who, whether they do well or not, actually care about what it is that they're learning for some reason that it actually impacts them on a day to day basis. These kids are the ones who were placed in the right education systems. They had just had a lot of support and things going for them where what was being taught had direct connection to what they needed in their life at any given moment.
Mm.
And I feel like so often we kind of glamorize the kids in the middle bucket, but I just feel like really what's underlying there is if you remove the grades, if you remove the competition, if you removed all of that, people would completely stop to learn, which you can 100% see in everyone in their 20s once they've left their college. I mean, just simply go around and ask, have you read a book since high school? Have you read a book since college where you no longer are given some sort of reward to read, right? Which shows that there was no genuine connection to the process of learning itself, which I find to be a fundamental failure. And so, one of the most important things, and as we were talking earlier, is finding that connection. I have a really hard time with that with some fields. So, when I'm teaching a student, I always try to tell the parents that I'm working with this. I would love to just find projects that your child is interested in pursuing and try to connect whatever it is that we're trying to learn to that project. To kind of go at it in the opposite direction, I feel like is a very dehumanizing process of education, which is we're going to teach you all this stuff first, whether it has direct application or not. And then later in your life, you figure out how to use it yourself. Right. And I think often it can be structured in the opposite direction, which is let's first listen to what you have to say. What is it in your life that you need? And then we will find all the tools that you need to learn to go do it. And that is the whole conception behind project based learning, for example. And so I just find what you're saying to be so relevant and important in finding love for learning, which is philosophy in a lot of ways. And so
Yeah.
yeah.
Oh, excellent. Thank you for that. I mean, look, I like your, I'm going to call it your triadic typology. That's a fancy word for your three kinds of
Yeah.
students. I mean, I don't have one, but I certainly I like to speak to your first category and your second. Um, and I'm sort of like you here. I'm going to say something like, there does seem to be, I'm going to say there's the appearance that there are students who don't care about school. Now, of course, that depends, right? I mean, I think I've encountered those students who, for an example, they get out of high school and that was rough, and then they're sort of like, I don't want to go to college, have no interest, I'm going to do something else. And some individuals, you might think, well, and let's say they go on to do something else and they do it well, something successful, they do it successfully well, fair enough, right? I'll just say fair enough. But of course, I don't buy into the college material language. I don't like that. I'm not college material. But there are some individuals who may not see, let's say, higher education, so-called higher education, as college or university as being the thing for them, and they may not. But this category of don't care about school, I'm going to say with you that part of it could be the failure of good teachers. And I think that's it, or the systemic failure of the educational system itself, right? And so what I think is that when students may express a kind of apathy or a kind of they're showing that they don't seem to care, I think that what we should do as teachers is we need to find an entry point, as you suggested. Like,
Hmm.
what is it that interests you? You and I are really coming back in a really nice way, spiraling, coming back to the point, but at a higher level. I think that we have to not extract from the relevance, right? I mean, there could be a student who doesn't like to write. See, may not want to read Shakespeare or write about Shakespeare. Well, does the student like rap music, right? And this could be a form of empowerment. Well, can you rap about what Shakespeare is saying, assuming that the school, your earlier high school, has deprived you of, I'm going to say that, who hasn't taught you well how to master the English language or what have you. So you make use of their strengths, and you use those strengths for the purpose of doing this other thing that they may find meaningless, they may find uninteresting. But guess what? Once you've pulled from their strengths, watch them excel, right? So I'm
Mm.
with you on this. I'm not sure if there is the uh, don't care about school uh, definition of that person who is fixed. I think that the don't care about could be hiding, I don't care about because I'm not finding this interesting, right?
100%. Yeah.
Because and I say that sort of as a warning too, because it's easy for teachers to say things like, "This person just doesn't care for school. Let them go." You know,
Mm.
then they're hopeless, right? And the other category, I've encountered that a lot, which is they do well, but they do well because they test well. They test well because they have a larger aim in mind. And what is that aim? To become a doctor, to become a lawyer, or whatever it happens to be, to become wealthy. This is the driving neoliberal. I think we talked about this before. The driving neoliberal understanding of the human being as Homo economicus. The idea is to act in one's own best interest. And I have encountered these students, white, black, Latinx, you name it, students of color. And I think that you know, this is a huge problem, right? It's what Thomas Nelson Baker, again, who's the first black male to get a PhD in philosophy from Yale in 1903. He has this line where he says, "You have gone through education, but education has not gone through you."
Hmm.
And I think that this is what's happening, right? Their sights are on a certain kind of capitalist neoliberal endeavor. What they have been taught to value is success, something that can be measured in terms of material success rather than measured in terms of the kind of human beings that they've become. That is to say, the
Mm.
quality of their critical thinking, the quality of what it means to be a critical, intelligent citizen, what it means to transform the world for the better, what it means to
Mm.
tackle issues of poverty, tackle issues of reproductive rights for women, tackle issues in terms of issues of transphobia, anti-black racism. These things have become secondary or even non-existent to the project of making money, right? And so
Mm.
what's interesting there is a good point, right? They get the good grade. They may even get A's on their exams, right? But we want to question, I think, as teachers, are we doing our job? Are we
Mm.
doing our jobs? Is our job to teach students uh, and to praise them, to teach them to test? Is our job to just praise them because they're getting good grades? Good grades does not make good grades does not make a critically um, creative, intelligent person. It's just not the
Mm.
case. So what we want, I think, is an educational process that gets students to rethink the telos of education to involve the accumulation of wealth,
Mm.
right? What about spiritual wealth? What about intellectual wealth? What about ethical wealth, right? What about the wealth of integrity, the wealth of honesty, right? The wealth of
Mm.
virtue, the wealth of kindness, the wealth of hesed, which is a Hebrew word that means loving kindness. We don't teach those things, and we don't catch our students in the process, right? So I
Mm.
think that, and of course, that third category that you have is ideal, right? It's that student who tries their best. Maybe they don't do so well on the exam, but they're still flourishing, right? And
Mm.
I think that's what we want, and we can get them. We can help them with the other things, right? If they feel that they lack in a certain kind of area, then we direct them to an office or to a person who can help them to increase their skills, or if it's a writing quote unquote problem that they're having, well then, hey, let me show you how to improve that area by going to a writing center. But for me, education, we talked about this before, comes from educare, which means to lead out. And part of that leading out involves a defamiliarization of the familiar. And
Mm.
there's this beautiful German term. It's pronounced Unheimlichkeit, and Unheimlichkeit means um, unsettled, the unfamiliar. And what I want to do is to produce those kinds of students who are unsettled, who are not satisfied, who are dissatisfied, in fact,
Mm.
um, who are dissatisfied with injustice, who are dissatisfied with the way in which the world is organized, who are dissatisfied with pervasive forms of poverty, right? And look, let's face it, in a way, even when you teach at an institution, a big university, there's a way in which we as professors also, even if unconsciously, perpetuate a capitalist system that is designed to produce more individuals who continue the system moving forward.
Mm.
So there's a way in which to think about ourselves as sort of these sort of the managerial class, right? Where we manage students and make them conform and produce them along the status quo so that they can keep the current system moving
Mm.
rather than trying to educate, lead out students outside of the status quo way of thinking, outside of a certain kind of um, um, echo chamber, and to get them to critique the society that they're about to become, as it were, fully fledged members of, right?
Mm.
And so that we can then halt or temporarily bracket this idea that education is meant for a certain kind of preconceived notion of success.
Hmm.
Yeah.
I feel like we could part three, part four, part five, part six. I mean, I think that's the thing when it comes to philosophy. You could pretty much talk about so many things and it keeps running because part of your job is to think and just,
Absolutely.
you would have ideas on education, on race, on, every single social issue. I mean, we could, whether we're experts or not, we could speak at least a little bit about. And I feel like
Absolutely.
because of that, the conversation can run so deep and there's a large well of just things to be said and share. And so, I want to say again, thank you so much for coming on and joining this part two. Given time, maybe a year from now, we could do part three and part
Yeah,
four. And,
sure, sure, sure.
I would love to keep these conversations going because I think your voice is extremely powerful and very important. And I think a lot of the things that you're saying are so just relevant to education. And yeah, so thank
Yeah,
you.
thank you. Thank you. I'm honored. Thanks.
And that brings us to the end of our conversation. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. Thank you again for listening and making this process so much more enjoyable. If you haven't had the chance to already, make sure to subscribe to the podcast on Spotify, Google, and Apple Podcasts to get the latest updates on new episodes. If you've been learning useful information here, feel free to leave a review as well. A little bit goes a long way in spreading this podcast. And have a wonderful day. And as per usual, stay re-educated.